Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Jar. I am your host, Dusty the SaY-DiST, and in this episode, I thought I would give a somewhat brief history of professional wrestling just to kind of get everybody up to speed because I'm going to stop assuming that everyone who listens to this podcast is a professional wrestling fan. I actually know for a fact that there are quite a few of you who are not watching or not listening rather because you're pro wrestling fans, and so to kind of make that a little easier for you to follow along with the podcast and understand exactly what's going on and being said, I thought that this episode would be a good not necessarily a starting point, but just a good episode to kind of like a refresher, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, the reason why I'm saying all this is because professional wrestling has a long history of obviously good and bad, but its beginnings is, in my opinion, very interesting, and it's something that not a lot of people know about. So I'd like to, if I could, for just a brief moment, talk about some of wrestling's beginnings and how it sort of transitioned into the scene that it's at now. But I mean, to put it politely, or simply rather, I should say, not politely, to put it simply, professional wrestling now, or wrestling as it was called back then, is just, it's a, let's see, how can I put this? It's a public event or spectacle or whatever that kind of draws in a crowd, tries to keep their attention, and obviously the goal is to make money, but it didn't originate as just some guy with like fucking, it didn't originate as somebody with like 15 wrestlers on their roster and decided, hey, this is gonna draw in a crowd, this is gonna make me some money, yada yada yada, let's do this. So where it actually began at was way back in the day, like in the early, but kind of late, well, not early, in the mid to late 19th century, actually. Wrestling became a little more exposed. It started becoming a little more exposed in terms of like to an audience, not necessarily exposed as in the business, but it started being exposed to the audiences. And I'm not gonna say, oh, audiences were eating it up hand over fist and all that, but people that enjoyed it obviously. But the people that went, they enjoyed themselves. The people who went to the other events and stuff of the, which I'm gonna get into in just a moment. The other events have they've been drawn in by the barker and stuff like that, and it kind of teases them in to watch it. Now, the reason why I say barker is because professional wrestling's heritage is all the way back to the traveling carnival days, back when carnivals would go from town to town to town to town, and state to state to state to state, and then all that junk. Now, how did professional wrestling get its start in the traveling carnival? It's very simple. Professional wrestling in the carnival environment began as basically a carnival, I guess you could call them a promoter at the time, but I don't really know the specific term for them. But you had, well, I guess the owner of the carnival would pick a specific person, like let's say a really strong, muscle-bound dude, It's like, all right, this is going to be our Mr. Undefeated, and he's just going around crushing opponents and beating people up like it's nobody's business, all of his matches lasting less than like 3 or 4 minutes, And they do that enough times to kind of intrigue people with the show and keep eyes on them and stuff like that, keep people watching and interested and engaged. And then eventually, at some point, people started to question the legitimacy of the wrestlers, not necessarily like the moves and stuff themselves, but they're more like, that guy's not so tough, I could take him in a fight, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I'm better, he may be a little taller than me or a little heavier than me, but I can still get him, I'm squirrely, And so I assume, and I could be wrong about this, but I assume the carnival barkers and the carnival owner was like, you know what, we're going to start holding open challenges to where the wrestler will get in the ring and then issue an open challenge to anyone in the arena. And then I think at that point they were still having guys that were familiar with the wrestler and familiar with the wrestling program and stuff, they would kind of have him sort of planted in the audience to, oh, I'm gonna kick your butt, blah, 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 and then kind of argue with the wrestler in the ring until eventually he was goaded into getting into the ring and it became a one-on-one match. The whole point of that being to show people that, hey, our wrestler is really big, really strong, able to defend themselves. You get in this ring, you better be prepared too, or you're gonna get squashed out. And that went for a little while, and the novelty eventually started to wear off. So what they did was just start picking actual people, and then the wrestler in the ring would quote unquote lay it in or not hold back. Like he would really take it to the people that jumped in the ring with him. And yeah, that's kind of how it started to gain some exposure, not necessarily mainstream exposure, but just exposure in general to where people were paying attention to it and aware of it. Then yeah, as things went on, it started getting a little more nuanced and things like that. They were starting to try to figure out, okay, we need to work on new ways to get people in to see the show. How can we gauge their interest and stuff like that, right? So they continued just like mixing matches and mixing match types and wrestlers and stuff like that. And then you start getting into your specialty matches. Not necessarily right away, but eventually you start getting into your specialty matches, which is like let's see, I'll use a great example of two legitimate pro wrestlers. The American Dream Dusty Rhodes versus Bruiser Brody in a no holds barred, no disqualifications match. You know, people that know Dusty Rhodes are coming up to see him. People that know Bruiser Brody are coming up to see him, and it's just, it's a good mix of the audience. And seeing a no holds barred, no disqualifications, meaning like, no holds barred, meaning you can do anything you want to the guy, like any type of move. You can poke him in the eye, you can kick him in the groin, basically whatever you want. And no disqualifications means doing any of that stuff will not get you disqualified or cause you the match. So you can hit him with anything. And then from there, wrestlers started to improvise and things like that with the hardcore matches, and then the just stipulation style matches in general. Like, okay, if I beat you, then your manager has to be my manager for a week. Or in at least one case that I can remember, there was a wrestler saying, if I beat you, your girlfriend or your wife becomes my girl for the night or something like that. And those specialty matches and stuff, they started trying to draw in a bigger audience. And then I'm sure at the very beginning, and even now, I'm sure that the specialty matches and the crowd pleasers, as they were called, essentially, were able to draw people in and get them to actually want to spend money to come into the area, arena or tent or whatever, have a seat and watch the matches going on. And so then you started developing your weight classes, and then you eventually get to a point where we have to expand. We have to change our format a bit, but not too much. So they started adding in rules here and there, kind of not written rules specifically, but just like the kind of rules that you would see essentially every wrestling promotion thereafter adopt. And it was intriguing to say the least. But they had to do more than just, okay, let's have specialty matches and just have like specialty stuff with the main guy calling out fans and things like that, and beating up people that we bring in from other states or other countries or whatever. So they started, I'm not sure about the time frame. Anybody can fact check me or correct me in the comments or whatever you feel necessary. I don't mind. But eventually they started working on the tag team division, and that became a treat in and of itself, because when it first started, I'm sure people's wigs were blown back. Like, there's 4 wrestlers in the ring as opposed to the traditional 2, and then only 2 can be in the ring at the same time, and the other 2 have to tag their partner to get out, aka slapping the hand, to tag. And then that would later on be evolved to just touching your partner in any friggin' way, like their shoulder, tapping their boot, or the back of their head, or what have you, you know what I mean? But I digress on that. um, after tag team wrestling and stuff was introduced, they started trying to work kind of like storylines and angles and things like that started to ramp up a bit more because they wanted to keep not just the audience engaged, but to be able to draw in a new audience, somebody who hasn't seen professional wrestling and are at least curious about it, or like, what's that going on over there? That sounds interesting. There are so many people that are digging the hell out of that. I want to go see what's up. So they go over there and check it out, you know? And that's what the wrestling promotions are hoping for, is that they can get a bigger audience and a bigger audience and a bigger audience each week, you know? Because I don't know if you guys know this, you non-professional wrestling fans, but the bigger the audience, the more money you make. So that's kind of why audiences are so sought after in professional wrestling, is because if I got a lot of eyeballs on me, I'm gonna get a lot of dollars to come with it, you know. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that mentality. That is a smart business plan, and it's been working for generations since at least the 1940s and 1950s, probably even earlier than that, you know, when wrestling first started, which I think was around the late 1930s. I could be wrong. I think it may have been the 20s, but it's somewhere in the early part of the 1900s. I do know that much. I think I mentioned earlier that it was like late 1800s, but I honestly don't think it, or late 1900s. I don't think it was the late 1900s. Pretty sure it was at least 1930s, 1940s, something like that. At the very least, 1920s. But since then, they started, you know, just getting trying to get more popular and more popular and draw in as much, like I said, as much people as possible. And then over those years, or over the years following that, carnivals started to slow down to the point where they weren't necessarily traveling circuses and carnivals and stuff anymore. They kind of petered out into, you know, little state fairs and county fairs and city fairs and stuff like that. So like the little fair foods and the little stuff like that, it all originated from the traveling circus, and people are just deciding, hey, we want a circus whenever we want. We don't want to have to wait until the circus comes into town or whatever. We're just going to have one here, have one now. We're going to call it whatever and do something about it. You know what I mean? And you can't really, because gathering and socializing and stuff like that isn't necessarily a crime. Well, depending upon what you're doing, I suppose, but it's not necessarily a crime. So, yeah, with all that being said, the thing about professional wrestling is, after fairs started, you know, becoming more and more commonplace for not certain, but for like all towns and cities and stuff, or at least all the ones that could afford it or even had interest in doing it, each little area started thinking, okay, we need to draw in a wrestling crowd because there's obviously a decent enough sized crowd nationwide. So we should probably continue to popularize it and continue to keep eyeballs on it and continue to draw dollars and eyeballs. Because, you know, if you're like I said earlier, it's a great business plan. If your job is to make money, you want to keep making money. That's how you continue to have your job. Ridiculous that some people need that spelled out for them, but I've known quite a few people who, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You know what I'm saying? But so you have these fairs set up in like each town and each city and stuff like that, state and etc. They started wanting to promote wrestling and trying to draw in eyeballs and stuff like that. So they would have like matches in their fairs and stuff like that. And eventually, I don't know exactly the year or anything, but eventually, former like actual wrestlers decided, hey, I want to keep doing this and keep making money and, you know, vested interest and whatnot. So they started not necessarily opening wrestling schools, because that didn't come until much, much later, but they started like holding essentially like auditions for wrestling and things like that. And they would bring guys in and teach them a little bit about how to work and how to do this, how to work being how to wrestle, how to sell, which means how to make your audience believe that you are truly hurt, or sell the effects of a move is to like portray that you are essentially almost dying from something. Well, not necessarily almost dying, but just that it registers as something painful. You know what I mean? You're reacting to it. You're selling. You're showing a reaction, be it guttural or happy or whatever. That you know what I mean. You're selling it. Now, there's a few. There's quite a few wrestling terms that I'm going to mention throughout this episode, and yes, I will be explaining each and every one, maybe not in intricate detail, but I'll at least give you a basic rundown so you're not necessarily lost and you're able to follow along with the episode very well. You know, I don't want to like ostracize anybody or stop anybody from enjoying my content simply because they're unaware of what the hell I'm saying. It sounds like a foreign language or something sometimes. I've been told that quite a few times. Um so yeah, you had your former pro wrestlers trying to bring in guys that they could work with to try and keep a vested interest in professional wrestling, so that way they could but they can continue to make money well into their early, twilight years. And because wrestling at the time and even still is not fake, I don't like that word, it's choreographed at best, meaning that a lot of the movements and a lot of the stories and stuff within wrestling are fabricated, aka they are not true. But to say professional wrestling is fake is to say that being dropped on your head, it's no big deal. And yeah, professional wrestlers take a lot of, they used to, I don't know, they probably still do, take a lot of pride in protecting their opponent so they don't kill the guy or the girl or whatever. They just happen to make it look like they do. So, you know, the moves actually hurt. They're not faked. They're not as choreographed as people think. They're done in a way to where they're protecting both the person doing the move and the person taking the move. Because, like I said, wrestling's been around since the 1920s, and there are a multitude of life-threatening injuries that a lot of wrestlers have faced. Even some have died while wrestling, and a lot of people don't believe that, but you can look it up. I assure you it is very true. Unfortunate, but very true. Not only have people had life-threatening injuries and lost their lives because of professional wrestling, but anything can and will happen. And especially since wrestling doesn't have some giant cleanup crew to run in and scrub the ring down and flip the mat over and change it out and all this when it's wet or anything like that. And I'm just telling you, you walk on a wet ground, there's a reason they put those wet signs up, the wet floor signs. Because walking on wet ground is not a good idea. Doesn't matter if it's on a canvas or if it's outside the ring. And so, I want to put something to bed real quick. The professional wrestling ring is not a damn trampoline. It's not a mattress with a sheet over it. It's very stiff. It gives maybe a quarter to less than a quarter of an inch of give in it, so that way you don't break your spine when you're slammed on the damn thing. Jumping off the top rope onto the ring, especially when a guy moves and you're landing like body first and not just feet first on the mat, it does not feel like, I'm gonna flippy floppy land on the bed. No, it's like taking yourself up to about maybe a 3-4 foot elevation and then leaping onto the ground. It's gonna hurt, or at least you're gonna feel it in some way, shape, or fashion. But yeah, so you started having these other promoters, or these other people rather, I should say. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, I apologize. These other people who had a vested interest in a lot of pro wrestling, or had seen a lot of pro wrestling and therefore became pretty knowledgeable about it. They started working with the wrestlers, actually like the older wrestlers that were a part of the originals when wrestling was starting to get its foothold. These wrestling historians essentially would work with the former pro wrestlers and start building a roster, if you will, and a company out of the local talent that were there in that specific area. And at first, I'm sure it was just like in a whole state, it was maybe the largest city had a like a wrestling promotion or arena or some type of thing going on to where people could get into and get instant access to, rather, wrestling when it was being put on. And then from there, you transition into a point where people, not just in, you'll have somewhere in like let's say Louisville, Kentucky, you'll have a professional wrestling company or a promotion. And then people in the other parts of Kentucky, the wrestlers and wrestling will travel around the state, or even a tri-state area like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, and just hit as many towns as they can in that little loop. But eventually, people started getting, again, they started getting a little restless, and I'm tired of waiting for wrestling. Let's just start our own. And that's how you got territories. You had wrestling manager, or not managers, but like wrestling promoters and bookers and things like that. A booker being a guy who books the matches, meaning they select like The Undertaker versus Steve Austin, and then they let them know between the two who's gonna win and how they want the flow of the match essentially to go. It's like, all right, Taker, you're gonna fight Austin. He's gonna hit you with this. You're gonna hit him with that. And then for the finish, I want to see a big crescendo where you get the crowd gasping and just waiting with bated breath. And then Austin, you're gonna go over. You know what I mean? Going over means to win, by the way, for those who don't know. So you had wrestling promotions starting up in almost not every town, but in a large percentage of towns that kind of shared borders with a little bit of other states, so they could have a little more area to work in instead of just that one specific town, you know? And then from there, you started having interpromotional battles to where there's a company in Tennessee and they heard about the company in Kentucky, so they want to cross promote, meaning some wrestlers from the Tennessee promotion and some wrestlers from the Kentucky promotion are going to wrestle each other. And they would do this by staging essentially like not necessarily takeovers, but just staging like invasions and like, oh, we're here at Smoky Mountain Wrestling. We came down from the friggin' Florida Championship Wrestling area, and now we're gonna take you down and all this. And so the FCW wrestlers, Florida Championship Wrestling, in this example, would come into the Smoky Mountain Wrestling territory and actually into the promotion during one of their shows and start calling out their wrestlers or beating down one of their top stars and stuff like that to try and get the crowd hooked with the angle of, oh snap, these wrestlers are from somewhere else and they're beating down the top guy in this promotion. That something's going on here. What the heck? And so people are, again, vested interest and starting to watch more and just get more and more intrigued by it and enthralled with it, you know? So you got the interest from the fans, you got the interest from the promotions itself, because at this point, wrestling was becoming so big that they were able to break away from the carnival and the fair and stuff like that, and they became an entity on their own. And as generations passed, and you know, not necessarily generations, but as decades passed, and generations too, honestly, people started, you know, coming into wrestling, and it started to expand more and more and became a little more nationwide known, nationally known, I should say, rather. People were starting to see the real money maker in it. And then you had people who came from like, okay, for example, back way back, going rewinding back a little bit, way back in the days of the carnival era, when, you know, the traveling circuses and stuff, professional wrestling, like I said, would go all around the country, or as far as they could, you know, as far as the promoters' money would allow them to go, and would take their act all across the world, or across the country rather, excuse me. People from other countries, like you know, along the Mexican Texas border and stuff like that, they would come to shows in America and see some wrestling and stuff like that. And eventually somebody took the idea back to Mexico of, hey, we should start our own wrestling thing. And they did. And it became known as Lucha Libre. And thank God for that, because professional wrestling in all its forms, I personally think, is very, very glorious, for lack of a better term. Then you had people from Japan who had either heard about it or seen professional wrestling, people in the UK, people in the Netherlands, people down in freaking Hawaii, people over in the other parts of the Pacific Islands, people in Australia, and just slowly but surely it started becoming a worldwide phenomenon. And even then, when it was just starting to reach its peak, people still didn't know where it was going to go, because They were just more worried about the money they're making from it and not necessarily worried about what kind of legacy or anything it was leaving. They were just like, hey, this is a great money maker. This is a great opportunity for me to get fame or money or both or whatever I need, you know what I mean, to kind of get to a place in life where I feel like I can just retire and sit on my butt. And, you know, you had people like doing that stuff for generations and generations until eventually promoters, like we're going to say closer to about the late 60s, early 70s, you had wrestling promoters who essentially they just started getting way greedier and decided that, hey, I not only want to be in charge of my wrestling promotion, I want to start taking over other promotions in other states so that way I can expand my reach to where I might have a professional wrestling company here in New Jersey, but I want to get people watching from Florida, or I've got a promotion here in Washington State, but I want to get people from like North Carolina to watch, you know? So you had people, promoters, mostly promoters being obviously the owners or the be all end all of the professional wrestling promotions, they would go around and just start making deals with wrestlers to either, hey, you should not work for them, come work for me, I'll pay you double or whatever, or I'll give you less dates, or I'll promise you this and I'll promise you that and all that, you know, and stealing people's talent from each other, going to putting on shows in like the exact same town, like, oh, there's a Smoky Mountain Wrestling show tonight. Let's have a WCW show the exact same night, the exact same hour, just maybe 20 minutes further down the road. You know what I mean? And they try to sabotage and draw more eyes away from the promotions that are trying to promote in town and draw a lot of promotion and eyes to themselves. And the unfortunate part about that is a lot of the promotions that were using these sneaky and underhanded tactics, as a lot of professional wrestling promoters call it, they were usually just running like very, very, very independent shows. And by that, I mean the most veteran guy they have working on their roster is like maybe 60 years old, and everybody else is like some 17 to 25-year-old kid that can't even wipe their butt without winding their watch or what have you. You know what I mean? They're just like lost essentially. And yeah, it's ridiculous. That's what helped sabotage pro wrestling by its own people, essentially. Other promoters and other wrestlers and other wrestling companies deciding that, hey, we want to do it bigger, we want to do it better, we want to take everything from you and give it to us, you know. It's mine, I want it, give it to me. That's basically the mentality of it. It's just like, oh, you're making some money, you're doing good for yourself financially, I'm going to come in, start taking all of your money, bankrupt you, and then I'm just going to move on to the next area and start doing the exact same thing, because who cares? As long as I get paid, as long as I get money, as long as I continue to thrive, I don't give a crap about anybody else. And that's the basic gist of a greedy mentality. It's just anybody with dollar signs in their eyes, that's all they're going to see. How can I get further while pushing everybody else down? Because, and it's not even like they're looking at it like I'm going to push everybody down. It's just, I don't care who I have to step on to get where I want to be. I don't care what it takes. I don't care who I have to cross. I don't care who I have to upset. I don't care about anything but my bottom dollar. That's all it is. And, you know, it's disgusting to see that, but you look anywhere in the world and you'll see people like that in any profession, any shape or form of entertainment, media, sports, whatever. You got people that are just ridiculous like that. They continue to thrive off of the misery of others, essentially. But I'm getting a little passionate. I need to kind of reel it back in a little bit. I mentioned a few of them during this episode, but I do want to come back to professional wrestling terms, because like I said, a lot of people aren't necessarily as up to date on terms and stuff, especially if you're just a casual wrestling fan or not even a wrestling fan, just somebody wanting to listen to this podcast, which, by the way, I thank you very much. Please leave a like, a subscribe, and a comment. I would really appreciate that as well. I digress. So you have your basic terms like a heel and a face, which is a good guy being a face and a bad guy being a heel. A lot of people are curious about the term mark, and this actually predates modern pro wrestling. It's way back in the carnival days. A mark was somebody that the owners would kind of use to describe wrestling fans, Oh, he's coming to see us. He's a mark. We can get him because he doesn't know the truth behind it and doesn't know about the fixes that are put in and all this and blah blah blah. So they would call the fans marks because they were uninformed, just a viewing audience. Plus, they weren't in the professional wrestling business, so why did they need to know? You know what I mean? That was the mentality, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If you're not a wrestler, why would you need to know about wrestling? The intricate workings of professional wrestling. But I digress on that. Um, you've got stuff like a heat, which is getting heat means like you're getting people mad at you, getting a negative reaction. And by the way, that's not always a bad thing. There are plenty of heel characters, aka bad guys, who want to get heat, aka negative reactions, from the audience because that helps their bottom dollar and helps make them a little more sought after entity because people are constantly waiting with anticipation unlike any other to see this jerk wrestler get the absolute crap beaten out of them by somebody well deserving, somebody who champions for the people and somebody that everybody can get behind. You know what I mean? That's the basic storyline of a good guy, bad guy setup. You know what I mean? In a match. And rather than go too far into the details of wrestling terminology and stuff, I kind of want to take a moment just to mention the story of wrestling because a lot of people think the story of wrestling is what I just told you and that's it, about the history and then like a basic match. That's very one-sided, and that's how things used to be way back in the day in the 20s and 30s. But nowadays, the story of a wrestling match can be so much more than just this guy doesn't like that guy, so they're fighting, or this chick cheated on this chick and her husband cheated on another chick, you know what I mean, or what. It doesn't matter. The storylines can be a lot more than just promotion and build up and all that stuff, and then to crescendo. Some of the best matches will have that. They'll have promo being like when a wrestler's talking to either the audience or a camera in nowadays modern era, to where they're trying to sell being like get over the fact that, hey, I have a vested legitimate beef with something or someone, and this is why it's going on, or this is, they try to give little, not necessarily hints, but just try to give like little Easter eggs as to why they don't like each other or why this fight is so important. And, that's a really good match. People with, obviously they get vested interest in it. They want to watch that. They want to see that. But I firmly believe, and maybe not so much with the like undercards and jobber matches, with jobber meaning somebody who is brought in to, essentially they're brought in to never really win. They're just brought in to get their butts kicked and make the people that are beating them up look a lot stronger and better. And a lot of jobbers have done that tremendously well. We wouldn't have nearly as many superstars and legends in professional wrestling if there weren't mid-carders and jobbers, mid-carders being guys that are like gain some success but they'll never be the world champion. But if it wasn't for jobbers and mid-carders, there wouldn't be a lot of these legends and just superstars of pro wrestling that we have now. And that's kind of a little overlooked. But you can look at any match nowadays almost and see the story of the match, either a David and Goliath tale of like the bigger guy, trying to beat up the little guy, the underdog trying to win, You've got the good guy versus the bad team, to where it's like it's outnumbered 4 people to 1 is like the wrestler that they're wrestling, and then 3 people outside the ring on the other guy's side that are just like poking at one guy and prodding at him and trying to get him disqualified or get him off his game, you know what I mean? That's just a couple of, only 2 examples, obviously, but I mean, there are plenty more. You can watch a match, and if you actually not even pay attention, but if you just kind of watch for a minute, maybe 2 minutes, you can kind of get the feel of the match, because there is something called a feeling out process, and a lot of people think it's just a term to kind of sell you on the fact that it's real or whatever, but it's like that's not what the term feeling out process is. The feeling out process is more of a term for two wrestlers who have not wrestled each other understanding and getting a feel for how the other wrestler works so that they can get, better timing and everything. So that way one of them's not leaving in a stretcher legitimately or possibly got a tombstone above their head. You know what I mean? But again, I digress. I'm getting a little more impassioned, and I apologize for that. But, so you've got your stories in matches and things like that. And almost everybody I've talked to that doesn't watch wrestling, they're like, I don't get the storyline of this match. I don't. Why are these two wrestling? Well, first of all, they're wrestling because it's a wrestling promotion. That's like asking why two football teams are playing against each other. Because they're scheduled to play against each other. That's just the way it goes. Anyway, to watch the story of a match is very interesting. Just watch the match, and you can kind of see the story play out before you. Some matches have multiple matches for the story, like I said, because it's a long-term storyline to where they're getting the most out of it by kind of stretching the storyline out from just this person doesn't like this person, so let's have a one-on-one. They're kind of stretching it out and adding more elements as time goes on to kind of get people a little more excited about it, a little more just anxious to see this, you know what I mean? So you've got stuff like that going on. And in terms of like the stories and stuff, so again, you can watch almost any match and see the story. I beg any of you to sit down and watch a match and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Speaking for the non-wrestling fans, even for the wrestling fans, I would implore you to check out any match. A great match that I really enjoyed was AEW's I can't remember what pay-per-view, but it was Bryan Danielson versus Zack Sabre Jr. That was a friggin' technical masterclass, the likes of which I've not seen in a long time. But that, I'll save all that glazing for another day, so to speak. But, you got your heel in your face. You got heat. You got the thing to me that always seems really funny in terms of professional wrestling terms is not necessarily something that's used backstage so much as it's used to and for the audience to kind of give them an idea of what's going on. The foreign object, that's a term that I absolutely love, because what is a foreign object? Is it, okay, if a chair is a foreign object, does that mean it's a chair from like Spain? or hey, we're in Japan, right? But this is a foreign object and it's a spoon. Does that mean it's a spoon from America? You know what I mean? It's like, what's going on? Well, I guess not a spoon, but a fork with the prongs and everything. I've actually seen those used as wrestling weapons. Anybody can look it up on YouTube. It's really, really interesting. And it's not funny like people are thinking. It's actually kind of gruesome. Thank you, Abdullah the Butcher, for introducing that, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, you've got so many different wrestling terms, like you've got your heat, you've got your heel, you've got your face, you've got mark. I think I mentioned that earlier. Like I said, the foreign object thing is mostly for the audience. A big one is something I want to mention that I've heard quite a few people get wrong, or at least not entirely accurate. So I want to try to set the not necessarily set the record straight, but I at least want to give the audience, my audience here, a clear understanding of what the word means. Now, the word in question is kayfabe. Now, what kayfabe means is kayfabe has sort of, it's like a double meaning type word, to where if you are a wrestler and you see another wrestler in public and they walk up to you with this big smile on their face and their hands sticking out, they're a bad guy and you're a good guy, or vice versa. They walk up to you, you just look at them and say, kayfabe, brother or sister or whatever, and they're supposed to know that, hey, that means there's marks around here watching us. We shouldn't interact with each other in person because we're on two different sides of the spectrum of being good and bad. And keeping kayfabe just means to continue to try and sell to the fans that it's a legitimate wrestling work, and a work being like a real fight, essentially, in that context. But like, this is a real legitimate competition. We have to work the audience, work the marks and keep them in kayfabe. And so a lot of people think keeping kayfabe just means, oh, we got to pretend everything's real. And it's like, sort of, but that's not really it. I mean, kayfabe is mostly to just keep the marks out of the know, essentially. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, they have to believe everything is real. It's just they have to not know what we're doing is actually cooperative and not just punching each other in the face like two giant gorillas. Sorry, that visual image got me a little bit. So yeah, once you got to the era where promoters were selling each other out and stealing from each other and things like that, you started moving into, and this was shortly after the acquisition of like professional wrestling being on television was starting to generate quite a bit more business than they were expecting, I think. And so it became this huge sought after market to where, like, in professional wrestling, the dance, aka the big show, is to get to where your stuff is being nationally or at least locally televised, so you can start drawing in a lot more money when you go to different towns and things like that, because people are getting more exposed to your wrestlers and to your format and things like that. They're getting a little more familiar with it, And so because of that, you had wrestling promoters starting to just like ramp up the cutthroat tactics by essentially 1,000. And that got to the point where you had, like, I don't know, maybe 5 major wrestling promotions in America, dwindled down to like 3, dwindled down to 2, and then, as we mentioned in like episode 1, dwindled down to just 1 with WWE. And then at that time you had like Ring of Honor, ROH, CZW, which is Combat Zone Wrestling, and NWA TNA, which stands for National Wrestling Alliance Total Nonstop Action. And now it eventually went to just TNA, Total Nonstop Action, then went to GFW, Global Force Wrestling, and then back to TNA Wrestling. So, well, I think it was also Impact Wrestling at one point, but I digress. Anyway, it's Total Nonstop Action now. Ring of Honor is another promotion that still exists, although they have been bought by AEW and are now a developmental company or sister promotion, whichever way you want to put it. And what that means is the wrestlers and stuff that are working for Ring of Honor are getting exposure to audiences and getting experience working with in front of crowds and working with other wrestlers and stuff, and can eventually be called up. Well, called up is kind of basically they can be called by the promoter of AEW, in this case Tony Khan, and be like, hey, I want to bring you to AEW from Ring of Honor because I want to showcase you in front of a larger audience, the AEW audience, as opposed to just the ROH audience. And so you have things like that. And then you've got like a WWE, obviously, they're the big dog in town and have been since about 2000, mid 2001, something like that, early 2002 at best. And they ran with it for a long time. But you had plenty of other promotions that had, because let me back up a little bit. Once WWE bought out WCW, at that point, the territories were essentially dead. Before WWE bought out WCW, that isn't what killed it. What killed the territories is all, like I said, the whole rush for TV thing, because a lot of bigger local promotions were getting localized television, but like 7 a.m. you'll get like Smoky Mountain Wrestling, or Thursdays at 4 p.m. you'll get Georgia Championship Wrestling, stuff like that, And as promotions like WCW and WWE, WCW standing for World Championship Wrestling, by the way, just trying to keep up with explaining things and not just talking over people's heads, because not everybody is as invested into wrestling as I am, and I acknowledge that. So you had places like WCW and the WWE, and not just those two, but those are two of the top dogs. even NWA, National Wrestling Association or Alliance. I think it's National Wrestling Alliance. My bad. I don't know why I keep saying association. I think it's because of the NCAA. But anyway, they started to buy out the top talent from these local and smaller promotions, so much so to the point that these little promotions, every time they would, bring somebody from kind of like the mid card up, pushing them up to like a big star, some other company would snatch that guy up too. And they were just starting to lose more than they could replenish. You know what I mean? They weren't able to bring in that many new wrestlers, as many as that were leaving. So it kind of left them in between a rock and a hard place. And then once WWE bought out ECW and WCW and pretty much a bunch of tape libraries and stuff from other promotions, that kind of killed off the territories to the point where I think around 2002, right before TNA started, there was only WWE, WCW, and NWA in America, and I think those were just the big three, because you had Ring of Honor and Combat Zone Wrestling, who were just starting to work up the ranks and trying to get a following for themselves. And you also had a little kind of a niche promotion out in California called XPW, Extreme Pro Wrestling, which was a kind of a take on Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW, but with a West Coast twist of, hey, we're not just going to do violence, we're going to add like sexualization and all this BDSM and S&M and all this stuff that has nothing to do with professional wrestling, because at its core, professional wrestling being in the carnival circuit and in things like that are kind of, in my opinion, that's kind of proof positive that professional wrestling was and always will be, or at least should be, intended for families. You can't have a stripper out there showing her boobs and spanking herself in a G-string if you're wanting to have 5 and 6 year olds watch your wrestling. Parents aren't gonna freaking bring them back to see that kind of crap, and who could blame them? I wouldn't want to expose my kids to that kind of filthy garbage either. I mean, what the hell? People need to think sometimes, and they don't think. It's just ridiculous. But I digress on that as well. I went over a few things, a little bit of the history. I tried to touch on some of the wrestling terms. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get into as many as I wanted because, started getting sidetracked and getting a little impassionate and kind of just ranting and raving and going on. But I still have a little bit of time left here, and I think I can get through a few more wrestling terms and just try to explain a few things. And also, I want to apologize for the speed talking, like talking really fast and whatnot, because like I said, this is a topic I'm very passionate about. It's something very near and dear to my heart, and so I kind of have to stop myself a little bit and be like, hey, Dusty, take a breath, man. Just calm down. It's all right. Nobody here is trying to fight with you. You can say what you want to say, man. It's your podcast. Say it. If people disagree, they'll just say so in the comments. You've got a lot of terms in basic wrestling. I mean, like I went over the few so far. A tweener, which is that's a kind of a more of a modern term. I think that came around in mid to late 90s at best. And what a tweener is someone who is both a good guy and a bad guy, meaning they are technically a good guy, but they have bad guy qualities. In that, a perfect example of this, Stone Cold Steve Austin during the Attitude Era, in I want to say 97 to about 2000, at least 2001, something like that. That was a tweener. He was a good guy. The people loved him. He was over with the fans, always trying to do what was good for not necessarily the betterment of the promotion, but just always trying to do the right thing, so to speak. But a lot of times the right thing that Austin was trying to do was to help himself, but that's neither here nor there. The people loved him. The people championed him. He was kind of he was the blue collar guy that everybody could identify with. It's just some guy going to work, doing his job, can't wait to get off the clock to go home, maybe throw back a beer, relax, sit down, and just enjoy himself. But instead, he's got this pompous, moronic, smart mouth boss that just wants to drive him into the ground and just piss him off so much that he does something so irrehensible that he gets fired and is just, left with nothing, twiddling his thumbs, wondering what happened. And so he was, like I said, Austin was a good guy in that sense, but he was also kind of a bad guy in the sense of like he wasn't necessarily a role model type. I mean, the man drank beer quite a bit. He was not shy to use four-letter words as well as other slightly bigger words that were still less than nice, if you know what I mean, less than polite language. He used hand signs, and he wasn't in a gang, so you can imagine what I'm meaning there. And in terms of more wrestling terminology here, you've got heat, which is a negative reaction from the fans, and a lot of people, like I said, they want heat, and sometimes you can get heat with the boys, and what that means is the other wrestlers backstage have a negative opinion on you, and it's possibly going to affect your career, as it has with many pro wrestlers uh, all throughout the history of pro wrestling. I mean, if a bunch of people don't like you and they have some kind of pull with the office, have some kind of power with the office, they can essentially bury you and end your career at a moment's notice whenever they just up and decide to. Okay, so another wrestling term we can go over is just simply that, going over. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but basically to go over means to win, to become the victor of the outcome, or in some cases, it is a storyline in which one wrestler goes over, and there may be several matches in between during that storyline in which a few of them, the wrestler that's going over in the storyline, being put up or put over rather, and kind of elevated up to that star status from just the mid card and things like that. In order to get to the end of that storyline, they may have to take a couple of losses, and it kind of builds the suspense of the story and builds the character. And just really good wrestlers can evolve from any storyline they've been in and kind of add a little more to their character as they develop it. And you've got great people like The Undertaker, Mick Foley, Steve Austin, The Rock, Farouk, Bradshaw. I mean, literally the list goes on. That's just some that I can think up off the top of my head at this moment. But yeah, the list goes on, I assure you. But there's so many wonderful, wonderful wrestling terms, and unfortunately, I'm not a professional wrestler, so I can't give like the inside scoop or whatever. I can only tell you what I've been told and what I've learned throughout my years of dedication to pro wrestling. You know what I mean? You've also got the gaijin. That's a Japan specific word, or Japanese specific word, I should say. And a gaijin just means a foreigner. Specifically, it means like a white foreigner or an American foreigner, I think. I could be wrong about that. But in Lucha Libre, you've got certain terms, but a lot of those are Spanish. And unfortunately, I've been watching a lot of Mexican wrestling since I was about 17, and I'm 37 now, so it's been like 20 years. But I don't really know much Spanish at all. But I don't really seem to know a lot of Spanish. I mean, there's a few words I've picked up on, like tope con hilo, which is basically a front flip over the top rope. A front flip being a somersault, by the way. It's a front somersault plancha over the top rope. Then there's plancha, which is just leaping over the top rope. A suicide dive, or tope suicida, which is where you dive through the ropes into a somersault, basically. You've got stuff like that. And then in the UK, there's not really many differences between American and the UK in terms of like their terminology. But like I've mentioned before, the UK is usually more technical and a little more stiff, similar to the Japanese style in that way, but just a little more stiff and a little more technically sound
kind of more realistic looking wrestling than the American products. And, that's just being honest with you. You can watch any European promotion in their prime and then look at any American promotion in their prime, and you can definitely see the differences and whatnot. It's very easy to identify, and all you got to do is just watch it for a moment or two. Another thing that I could possibly mention, because like I said, I don't know a whole lot of wrestling terms, and I don't want to just start passing them all out. I kind of want to save a few of the terms and things that I know for the ending of each episode. Maybe throw a little bit of terms here and a little bit of terminology there, and kind of a little explanation about some things that I mentioned per episode. To kind of end on a positive note, so that way everybody can kind of go away from the podcast being happy. That's kind of what it's all about, at least to me. I'm enjoying recording this, but my goal is to ensure that you are enjoying listening to this, because otherwise I'm just ranting to myself, uh, and then uploading it online. So, but I thank you guys for stopping by and listening and just giving this podcast a chance. I know pro wrestling may not be a lot of your cup of tea, but it's mine, and the fact that you're willing to at least humor me and listen to this, and things like that, I really do appreciate that. That means a lot to me. And like I've said before, if you could like and subscribe and comment, that would mean just as much. It really would, if not more so, because it shows some dedication, and that's something that's commendable no matter what your dedication is. um I don't really know what else to say. I'm getting kind of to the end here. Been running a little long, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and stop it soon. But like I said, thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a wonderful day.